Welcome, everyone. My name is Laurie Schubert, and I'm the Executive Director of the Quebec Writers Federation, which you'll no doubt hear referred to tonight as QWF. We're so glad you're able to join us this evening as we pay tribute to Joel Yanofsky, a brilliantly talented and much loved member of the QWF community. Our community represents diverse individuals who live and create on traditional territories of many First Peoples. Tonight, we're meeting in a virtual space, but many of us and the QWF office are located at Jojage, which is what Ganyaga call Montreal. This place has been and continues to be a historical gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. And we at QWF are grateful to be part of a long and proud history of creating and sharing stories on these lands. And stories will indeed be shared tonight. 15 of Joel's friends, colleagues, students, and family members are here to speak, read, and in some cases sing, and to share something of what Joel meant to them. But first, I've got just a few housekeeping items to go over. We've enabled live transcription for those who are hearing impaired. If you see the transcript and you don't need it, you can turn it off by clicking on Live Transcript or CC in your Zoom control panel and disabling the feature. And if you don't want to see it, if you don't see it and you want to, go to the same place and you can turn it on. Just show subtitles. The chat function is open tonight. We encourage you, if you'd like, to share a short memory or just let Joel's family know that you're here. We'll be passing the transcript of the chat to Cynthia and Jonah after the event. We'll also post some information into the chat from time to time about the foundation that's been set up in Joel's name. And we'll share a link to the trailer of a film in which his family is featured. That's going to air in July on CBC. In a few days, we'll have the video of this event posted on our website. You'll be getting an email with a link to the page where you can watch it. Please feel free to share that. Finally, I'd like to introduce your host for the evening. Scott Lawrence is a writer who lives in Hudson, Quebec. His collection of short stories, Missing Fred Astaire, won the Q Spell Award for Fiction in 1993. And now, over to you, Scott.
Thanks very much, Laurie. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for being with us tonight. I see we're up to almost 200 participants now, and we're anticipating even more. So thank you very much for attending this tribute to our dear friend Joel. I also want to thank QWF very much for putting this event together for us. As most of you know, Joel made his way in the world as a writer of fiction, nonfiction, memoir, musical theater, literary criticism. His books include Homo Erectus, Jacob's Ladder, Mordecai Me, which won the 2003 Mavis Gallant QWF Nonfiction Prize and the Canadian Jewish Book Award. And his book Bad Animals, A Father's Accidental Education in Autism, which gained him international acclaim. Joel was also the co-writer of Love You, the Grad School Musical, and you'll meet his co-writer tonight. As a friend, I'm honored to say I was a friend of Joel's for about 35 years. Still miss him every day. This is not the first time, as it turns out, that Joel has brought us together via Zoom. Just a few days before he left us, a few of his friends were fortunate enough to get together with Joel via a Zoom call. He was in his bed in the palliative care ward at the Jewish General. And Cynthia had arranged so each of us on the call had a few minutes to speak to him. We shared a few memories, a few stories, some of them true, and we told him each in our own way that we loved him. Then his turn came to speak. He was very weak, but he launched into this is pure Joel, he launched into a 20-minute long roast of each of us, remembering significant moments with us, some of them funny, some of which made us squirm, some of them actually made us weepy. And he let us know he loved us. It was a brilliant, wise, brave performance, one of the bravest things I've ever seen. And it was the precise definition to me of grace under pressure. It was the last time most of us had a chance to speak with him. I think it was brilliant how he managed to get us all together for one last time, and also managed to get in the last word, because a few days later he passed. This evening we're gathered to honor him, to share our memories of him, and to express our love for him. Most of us certainly miss him every day, think of him every day. Our first speaker tonight is a friend of many of us, Mark Abley. Mark is, in his own words, an active nonfiction writer, an erstwhile poet, a former journalist, a retired editor, and just a really good man. He became friends with Joel during his stint as book review editor for the Montreal Gazette between 1989 and 91. In fact, that's how many of us who are on this Zoom call tonight met somehow through the Montreal Gazette in those years. Joel financed several vacations on the strength of the money he won from Mark, well, for many of us, to tell the truth, playing poker. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Mark Abley. Mark.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here, but in no way is it a pleasure. We miss so many things about Joel. On the old writerly principle of show, don't tell, I want to reveal some of those things, not in my own voice, but in Joel's. It's thanks to his illness that I began to communicate by text message. Anyone who knows me will understand how astonishing this is. Tonight, I can't bring him back. My God, how I wish I could, but I can repeat some of his own words. In early November, I wrote to him shortly after his operation, wishing him well, and he replied, "Hey, out of surgery, challenges ahead, but feel better this moment. Look at me, all zen." A couple of days later, I said, "How are you feeling today?" Annie just told me that the big wood pile I created is in the wrong place, and now I have to uncreate it. This is one way to avoid writing a book. Joel was also in the midst of writing a new book. He replied, "Prefer your way. Don't know if you have my latest update. A tumor found in my rectum. Auto-check offered rectifying and recriminations. Oh well." The following day, I asked how he was feeling, and he wrote, "Thanks, I can finally start drinking. The apple juice made me cry, and I don't even like apple juice." I sent some flowers to his hospital room through an excellent service run by Summit School, and he texted me to say, "Did you send a gift? The writing is too legible." Days later, I told him I'd seen 2 loons on Lac Saint Louis. He replied, "I saw 2 loons in Scrubs, so there." I asked if he'd had the MRI he was waiting for. "Not yet. Still waiting." I said, "God only knows." And Joel came straight back with an incredibly apt line, "The help goes away again without helping. Kafka." He knew I knew that Franz Kafka, who also died far too young, had lost the ability to speak in the final weeks of his life. He communicated with nurses and family by writing brief notes on scraps of paper, some of which were saved for posterity. Almost a century ago, Kafka was writing text messages. In a single line, Joel had seen my Beckett and raised it with a Kafka, while also implying how serious his condition was. And then in mid-November, Joel left the hospital. He texted me to say, "I'm home, had a shower, watching golf, so who's not living a full life?" Even though he was home, he was still in pain. I wrote and said, "If there's anything I can do short of yanking out the catheter, please let me know." And he replied, "I'm managing. The catheter is under control right now. Of course, other stuff pops up. The treatment gets started Monday, so we'll see then what the fresh hell will be." The treatment, I mean the chemo and radiation, never did start, and soon he was back in hospital again, this time for good. He quoted Kafka again to me in early December, and I said, "Well, as long as you don't feel like you've turned into a cockroach." He replied, "I'd settle for a healthy cockroach." At Joel's request, I bought a few gifts for Cynthia and delivered them on her birthday with a private message from Joel. It was a beautiful message which I will not read here. As he was writing it, he quoted Robert Browning to me. Still working on note for Cynthia, not sure what to say. Grow old along with me seems off somehow. I told him that in an email, a distinguished novelist and former member of our poker group had called him lovely. I said I was surprised by the adjective, but not the sentiment. Joel wrote back, "Who called me lovely? Not that there's anything wrong with it." When I said the name Trevor, he replied, "Be still, my heart." I said, "Of course, he may be a little old for you." Joel said, "I'm in no position to be choosy." Then his health got even worse, and I wrote, "I'm thinking of you and hoping things will improve a lot. As in Buffy's tombstone, she saved the world a lot. And then she came back for another couple of seasons." Joel replied, "I wouldn't have figured you for a Buffy person. The truth about how I am is in a kind of limbo, like Buffy. Whatever hope there is keeps getting put off. All the complications and setbacks are adding up and troubling." Then we reminisced a little about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. In the final 2 weeks, his texts got shorter. On December 17th, he wrote, "Afraid not better. If anything worse, may need you to pass this along sooner than later." The following day, he said, "Let's hold off for now. Different tests." I replied, "The hell of tests. I hope they bring hope." And he replied, "Hope. Huh. At least they're letting me sleep." And then there was the Zoom call Scott talked about. And then the heart and soul of our community was gone. And his many grieving friends were left to ask, how can so much courage, so much generosity, so many writerly skills, such an amazing sense of humor vanish like smoke in the wind?
Thank you very much, Mark. Our next speaker tonight is another dear friend and longtime friend of Joel's, Elaine Coleman-Naves, who's a writer, literary journalist, and teacher. And over the last number of years, they've done a fair bit of collaborating themselves together, and I'll let Elaine talk about that. Elaine.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. Thanks to everybody, first of all, who organized this wonderful event. Laurie, Scott, Marion, Brian, Chris. I hope I'm not leaving anybody out. And thanks for including me in this lineup. There could be so many other people because Joel had such an array of admirers, friends. He was my dear friend and colleague, and I miss him very much. Since his death, I've been reviewing the emails back and forth between us, tracing the arc of our friendship. The emails I can still find begin in 2003, but our relationship goes way back before then. In the late 1980s, I watched Joel from afar at book launches and readings with a wistful admiration bordering on hero worship. He was a successful professional writer, and I was a wannabe. From that era, I see him in my mind's eye lugging a bulky tape recorder to a function he was covering at the Jewish Public Library. I also remember him vividly on one occasion at the Côte Saint-Luc Library. By then, I'd broken into print, but I was still a neophyte, still very unsure of myself. My background wasn't in literature, but in history. I knew how to research a book, but not how to write a book review, or how to do the research for a book review. You have to think of a time before Google and before Siri. The library was still the place you went to do your research. Joel was sitting at a table surrounded by reference works. I observed him taking notes before he shambled off, a book bag slung over his shoulder. I then approached the table where he'd been sitting and examined what was on it. Piled up lay a scad of blue-gray encyclopedias with the titles Contemporary Author and Contemporary Literary Criticism. Here was a eureka moment for me. There actually were books devoted to the lives of current writers, books to their writing and books on their writing, books on their lives. So even before I knew Joel, he was pointing me in the right direction. He was teaching me the ropes of our trade. Eventually, we were introduced and we eyed each other warily, initially as competitors, vying for the same assignments at the Gazette. But this was still an era when freelancers weren't an endangered species, and there was room not only for the two of us, but for a whole stable of talented writers and reviewers. Once we realized this, we became comrades and pals. We were blessed with two great editors, our former speaker, Mark Abley, and the one who's coming after me, Brian Demchinsky. They became our mentors and our friends. Together with them, we had so much fun doing the work we loved. One small example. Joel and I shared a column space called Chapter 1 in the late 1990s. We sounded off about writers, books, literary prizes, whatever. Joel was never much for political correctness, and in one column, he fired off a diatribe about the new British Orange Prize, which was exclusively set up for women. I took umbrage and returned fire, rebutting his points in a column I called An Open Letter to My Esteemed Colleague. He never said a word to me about it, but afterwards, Brian let me know what his reaction had been. Couldn't she have just picked up the phone and told me off? The emails I've been reading attest to our ripening friendship. We both taught here at the QWF and guest lectured regularly for each other. Knowing how I hated to drive, Joel went out of his way to give me lifts. On the way to various literary events, we shared gossip, laughs, and a well of mutual affection. 3 years ago, we began our most intimate literary collaboration. Over a lunch at St. Viateur Bagel on Monkland, I proposed that since we were both having trouble getting started on new manuscripts, we should meet monthly, set deadlines for ourselves, and give feedback to each other's work, give feedback on each other's work. For this, there had to be trust at the very beginning. But this trust deepened over time as we were writing very personal books. The partnership proved invaluable. At each of our meetings, we apologized for how little progress we seemed to be making. Each time we met, Joel said to me, I've only written this because I know you're going to be reading it. And I echoed this sentiment back to me. In this way, we produced hundreds of pages between us. They weren't always good pages. And when they weren't, we told each other why and made suggestions for fixes. Joel also pointed me to new books, new podcasts, new articles on my topic. His antennae were tuned everywhere: low culture, popular culture, highbrow culture. My friend Joel fought a heroic fight. Cancer savaged his body, but it did nothing to quell his fierce intelligence and razor wit. To the end, he remained alert, engaged, and very, very funny. To the end, he quipped, punned, and kibitzed. And to the end, he remained a consummate pro. The last thing he wrote was a pitch to his agent and to his editor with a detailed blueprint of his work in progress, one he fully intended to complete. He wanted so badly to live. He hoped so much to live. When he realized this wasn't to be, he asked to be held in our hearts for a little while. In this heart, it will be for always. Joel liked quotes, so I'm going to close with one. It's from Experience, a memoir by Martin Amis, who I believe he also liked. This is where we really go when we die, into the hearts of those who remember us. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you very much. Our next speaker tonight is Brian Demchinsky, who is a Montreal writer and editor, and as was just mentioned, for a number of years. He was the books editor at the Gazette as well. I think it's hard to underestimate what a hotbed the Gazette literary section was back in the day for a number of us. A number of us made our original friendships there. Battled with Mark and Brian over what we could and couldn't write. and very much of the Montreal literary scene had as its sort of locus the Montreal Gazette book page. The book section was in fact 4 pages at least back in those days, something quite remarkable. Mark and Brian were a huge part of that. As I mentioned, Brian was Joel's editor at the Gazette for a number of years, and I think now he may tell us a bit about what that was like. Brian.
Thanks, Scott, and hello, everyone. Yes, Joel came into my consciousness months before I actually met him because of his writing. I don't mean I randomly picked up something he wrote. It was because I depended on his words. I was Joel's editor for more than a decade, and I needed what he had to say to make me look good. And I could help him look good by dressing up what he wrote with snappy headlines and putting him in front of an audience. This is one way that editing works. Our writer-editor relationship began when I became books editor at the Gazette. I inherited the job from Mark Abley, who wanted to go back to writing, and he's done pretty well at it since. I was a bit nervous in my new job, having to deal with highbrow literary gang after pushing around to reporters for most of my journalism career. But Mark kindly supplied me with 2 lists before he left. On one were the names of people I could depend on. On the other list, those I should avoid. The ones to avoid I've forgotten, but Joel quickly rose to the top of the A list. The thing an editor wants in a critic or any kind of writer is someone who writes clean copy, turns it in on time, has something to say, few axes to grind, and is ready for anything. And Joel excelled at all of that. He expressed his readiness in his memoir, Bad Animals, when he said, "Books lined up on my desk like widgets on an assembly line. They never stopped coming, nor did my hurried slapdash opinions of them." Imagine that. I wasn't an amateur anymore. I'd gone pro. And when the pro could write as funny as he did, well, that's who you went back to. The contents of the books we read, the features he wrote, these were mediums of exchange that built a bond between us that soon extended into other areas. We talked about our relationships, we gossiped, we had opinions about the state of the world, baseball, and poker. They were the bricks and mortar of a friendship, and they endured beyond our days at the Gazette. But there was one thing I couldn't do for Joel during that time, much to my regret. I could never deliver him a good review. He published 2 books while I was books editor, Jacob's Ladder and Homo Erectus, and both of them got, well, let's say, less than raves. Every writer knows that reviews are a crapshoot if the editor assigning them is doing his job, which is to say, not giving an author's book to a friend or enemy of the author. Every writer also knows that a reviewer's point of view is anything but definitive. Some writers say that reviews don't matter. Some say they ignore them, but I doubt this. A bad review hurts. Your brainchild has just been taken out and abused. Of course, Joel knew the rules of the game, and though he offered the odd crack over those reviews, he kept any disgruntlement muted, not only because I was offering him work, but because he understood our friendship was more important. Still, he was a guy who in another context once quoted to me a line by Martin Amis again, "Nobody ever gets over anything." I wasn't surprised to see the line pinned up on the wall in Joel's office when I went there recently to pick up some books that Cynthia had offered. Amis's words essentially apply to all writers I've discovered. And they made me wonder if some lingering hard feelings were the reason why even years after the Gazette, Joel challenged me with such ferocity and glee at the poker table, always with a come and get me smile when I had to guess whether he had a good hand or was bluffing. As players at the table and on the basketball court knew, he was intensely competitive, but he seemed to take particular pleasure in challenging me, and usually he took my money. In some ways, our working relationship and our friendship were like a marriage. There were ups and downs. there was also a bond of trust that overcomes that which is left unsaid. So yes, nobody gets over anything, but I dwell on the part of what is remembered. Joel bequeathed me his poker chips, the chips we have used in every game for almost 30 years. Sometime soon, I hope, the poker gang will be playing again, and Joel will be there with us, unforgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Charlie Foran. Charlie called Montreal home way back in the 1990s. Since then, and this is really the case, Charlie, since then, tragically, he has lived elsewhere and has been much missed. So it's wonderful to have him back with us tonight, even under these circumstances. Charlie has published 11 books, including a biography of Mordecai Richler, something he sort of shares with Joel, and I believe he may speak a bit about that. Charlie?
Thank you, Scott. It's an honor to be here tonight amongst such good people. A few words about Joel and Mordecai. As the ex-Catholic, ex-Montrealer biographer of Mordecai Richler in the period between 2005 and 2010, I needed all kinds of help from friends and strangers alike. On the friend side, there was no one better to turn to than Joel Yanofsky. Though not poker mates, the highest category of Joel friend, I suspect, we'd been basketball and book friends from back in the day. Like everyone else from back in that day, that group of writer, editor pals, many of whom are here tonight, I loved his wit and intelligence and powerfully sound instincts around what was good and what wasn't, and never mind the Toronto or New York driven hype. I also admired his courage as a writer, especially as a literary journalist. That is hard to manage and still keep even a leaky roof over your head. Who didn't admire these things about Joel, I realize. Who didn't find him just about the warmest, funniest, and most insightful commentator on books and on Anglo-Montreal, Jewish or otherwise, especially its deep character and especially its perennial cast of characters, deep or otherwise. I did consult with Joel while writing my Richler biography, and he was, as I recall, unfailingly generous. He also kidded me exactly once that he, of course, should have gotten the gig, be writing the big bio, not the ex-Catholic, ex-Montrealer he was so patiently advising. We both knew that the joke need not be stretched out. Joel had already written the better book, called Mordecai Me, published in 2003. In so doing, he had both disqualified himself from taking on the big conventional biography and already capped it in terms of acuity, authenticity, and reading pleasure. Joel didn't have more to reveal and share than what he revealed and shared in his Richler book. And though he did not say this, at least to my face, I wasn't even real competition. Put simply, he had gotten there first and staked the proper ground, and everything and everyone else was secondary and occupying lesser ground. If you haven't already done so, please read Joel's book about Mordecai Richler. Please. It is writer to writer, Montrealer to Montrealer, Jewish intellect to Jewish intellect. It is full-on funny and full-on fearless and full-on respectful, honest, unsparing, and melancholy, even sad. It is, in other words, maximal Joel Yanofsky, and it possesses that unmistakable quality of major books. No one else could possibly have written it. At a guess, Richler, who passed away before either of us published, would have shrugged Joel's book off in public while privately giving it the minimal, all you can hope for, nod of writer to writer, Montrealer to Montrealer, Jewish intellect to Jewish intellect approval. My book, I believe, he would just have shrugged off. Joel, I know I told you how great Mordecai and Me was before, during, and after I wrote my own biography of him, but I don't think I had the chance over the last decade to repeat this assertion. I am doing so now with all due gratitude and appreciation to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Thanks very much. I'm very pleased now to introduce Peter Curtis. Peter was Joel's collaborator on the surprising Love You, the Grad School Musical. Prior to this musical being written, I don't think any of Joel's friends suspected that he had a musical in him, but in fact he did. Substantial thanks for that urging. Go to Peter for this project. Peter's also Cynthia's cousin, and I'm delighted to say he'll play us some songs from that musical tonight, as well as a special song for Joel. Peter.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and whether she likes it or not, Cynthia is my cousin. So as well as being a collaborator and good friend, Joel was family. And about a week before he died, Joel told me that he wanted 2 songs from our musical played at his memorial. He asked for You Gotta Eat and You're a Masterpiece, the latter of which he wanted dedicated to Cynthia. Around the same time, Cynthia suggested I write a song for Joel. For the sake of time, I'll play abridged versions of all 3. First is a clip of You Gotta Eat from a performance of Love You at the University of Redlands here in Southern California. And to set it up, I have included some of Joel's brilliant, very funny dialogue.
You know, us Jews. Let me tell you something, Professor. Jews are born troublemakers. Monotheism and indigestion. That's what we're famous for. Pardon. But pushings is our legacy. How else do you expect to stay around 5,000 years? Look, don't kid yourself. I'm a proud Jew, but facts are facts.
Oh, you know, my father used to say that. Facts are facts. He also used to say, you gotta eat, kid. With that line and a good deal of guilt, he convinced me to stay in school so I'd have something to fall back on.
Well, your old man was right. Survival is underrated. All throughout our history, in times both poor and posh, we faced all our troubles with a little nosh. They persecute us and accuse us of deicide. Right. So we have a pastrami with a pickle on the side. They try to break us, so we eat brisket. Try to ruin us, we have arugula. Put us in the corner, and we have corned beef. Holler at us, we have holler. In our darkest hour, in times of dire defeat, they tried to kill us, we survive. Let's not, you gotta eat. They try to conduct us, we eat the dishes. Really hate us, we have Polish gods. Try to destroy us, we don't mix dishes. Lacerate us, we have vodka. So many Jewish holidays march to the same beat. They try to kill us, we survive. Let's not, you gotta eat. For pocket, for knuckle, for natal, let them Google. Bagel, force me out from antiquity to Google. Chicken soup and cholet, smorgasbord schmaltz. In our times of trouble, we say pass the salt.
Also from Love You, here's a recording of You're a Masterpiece with pictures of Joel and Cynthia, for whom Joel wanted this song dedicated.
Smiling Mona Lisa and all that's in the Louvre, Leaning Tower of Pisa and Monsieur Matisse s'ouvre. Pick Picasso's working blue, Rubens' gals obese. Don't compare to you, you're a masterpiece. And oh, Signor El Greco, apples by Cézanne. Anything Art Deco or sculpted by Rodin, the Sistine Chapel too, all of Rome and Greece. Don't compare to you, you're a masterpiece. Don't know much about art, but I know what I like, and now here's a clue. The rooms of my heart are a gallery that is now showing you it's true.
And last up, here's the song that I wrote for Joel. You always ended emails with the same line. Now those words play a different role. Here's the closing phrase you wrote to me so many times. So long, Joel. You always made us laugh with clever quips, and besides, your humor always showed your depth of soul. Here's the closing phrase you wrote to me so many times. So long, Joel. So long, Joel. So long, Joel. I'll keep you in my heart so long as it beats inside. So long, Joel. I'm grateful you were here and for the books you left behind. I hope in time your legacy will grow. Here's my valediction, your old closing line. So long, Joel. So long, Joel.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Gina Reutman. Gina's going to co-host a segment here in which we're going to talk a little bit about Joel as a mentor and as a teacher. Gina herself is a writer of short stories, essays, poems, and she has a first novel coming out in spring of 22 with Guernica Editions, inspired by Joel. She's currently leading several memoir writing workshops. I'm going to let Gina take it from there and introduce a few others who will speak about Joel as teacher and mentor. Gina.
Thank you. I first met Joel, like so many of his fans, in the pages of Mordecai Me. I love that book and the way Joel revealed himself in it. Something about him, his wit, his vulnerability, his self-deprecating humor, created for me as a reader an instant bond. And that bond only grew stronger with his remarkable memoir, Bad Animals. It was in Joel's QWF workshop on creative nonfiction that I came to admire some of his other remarkable characteristics. The way he listened carefully, how thoughtful he was in his critique of your work, and how he could pinpoint a problem with precision and an appropriate solution. But the one ability that held us all enthralled was Joel's total recall of literary passages by any number of writers that he would summon with incredible ease. When answering a question or plucking an example out of thin air, he could conjure a quote at the drop of a hat. As a gifted writer and reviewer and essayist, Joel was exceptionally versatile and has left a distinguished body of work. But as a teacher, a coach, a go-to source, he was also exceptional. Someone who never hesitated to share his knowledge by encouraging and nurturing other writers through workshops and mentorship that he provided under the aegis of QWF programs. The Quebec Writers Federation is inordinately proud of the symbiotic relationship we forged together and the legacy that remains. Finally, what lingers in my memory is Joel Yanofsky's generosity of spirit. As Ian McGillis once said, the word mensch was invented for Joel. Long after my stint as one of his students, Joel was always available for a chat over coffee and some free advice. We would sometimes meet in the aisles of Akavan, the Persian grocery store across the street from Joel's place, and he could always take the time to stop and ask me how things were going. Akavan and the annual birthday party Laurie and I throw to raise money for writers in the community, and the QWF Awards Gala. These were the few times a year we would have a chance to exchange pleasantries. When I was the chair of the 2014 QWF Awards Gala, it was the generosity and gentle humor, his generosity and gentle humor, that led me to propose him as the MC for the evening. I will never forget the first thing he said when taking over the mic to welcome everyone and to introduce himself. He quietly scanned the room with that sly smile of his and said with a perfectly deadpan face, "I know what you're all thinking. Is he really that short?" Now I'd like to introduce Neil Smith, who was mentored by Joel before Neil was first published. Neil is the author of the story collection Bang Crunch, which won the QWF McCausland First Book Prize, and the novel Boo, winner of the QWF Hugh McLennan Prize. His upcoming novel is entitled Jones. Neil?
I met Joel years ago when I signed up for the QWF's mentorship program. I was Joel's mentee, as he called me. He also called me Mutt and himself Jeff because I'm 6'1" and Joel was not. We'd meet in coffee shops, usually in NGG, and he'd give me pointers on the short stories I was writing back then. I'd never studied creative writing or literature formally in university, so I was eager to learn from this guy who'd impressed me by tackling so many types of writing: novel, comical essays, book reviews, biography, memoir, musicals. He told me he knew I'd eventually get published, and his confidence in my work at that early stage in my writing meant the world to me. He could have made an excellent editor at a publishing house. With editor suggestions, my instinct is to accept any comments that match the niggling feelings I might have about my work. And with Joel, we most often saw eye to eye, not only about the weak spots in my stories, but also about other writers' work. The exception being Jan Martel, whose Life of Pi I adored, and Joel, to say the least, did not. We often discussed how to weave humor into darker pieces, how to juggle the funny and the tragic, how to make art out of tragedy, a skill he'd mastered and one I wanted to perfect. Even after my mentorship ended, he continued giving me advice. He said he'd be my mentor for life. When an agent wrote to me about representing my work, Joel was the first person I contacted for his thoughts. When publishers made offers on my first book, Joel helped me decide which house to go with. He was like my second agent. When the book came out, he somehow wrangled me a cover story in Quill and Quire despite me being a complete unknown. He was realistic about the publishing world and could occasionally be a tad pessimistic. He said that the best time in a book's life is just before it's published because the writer's hopes haven't yet been dashed. Over time, I opened up to Joel about my past, my unconventional childhood and abusive upbringing, which rivaled the family in the glass castle. He wanted to know why I didn't touch on this in my writing. It seemed to him perfect fodder for a novel. I told him that for me, writing was an escape from the life I'd had. I wanted to slip into other people's shoes instead of wearing my own. Now, of course, Joel specialized in writing about himself, which he did brilliantly and with ease. Even his book on Richler blended events from Joel's life. Eventually, when you're ready, he told me, you'll write about the personal stuff. It'll come out whether you like it or not. I thought I'd never be ready to expose myself in the way Joel did, but he was right. And I did sit down and write that personal story for my third book, a new novel. It'll come out next year, and I swing from excitement to terror. The last time I saw Joel, I told him about the new novel. With that sly, knowing smile of his, he said, "I always knew you'd get around to writing that book." He knew the writer in me more than I did, I guess. He understood how writers work, from what wells they draw their water. I'll be forever grateful to Joel for all he taught me and for the work that he's left behind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Neil. Next is Claire Holden Rothman, a Montreal writer and translator. Her last novel, Lear's Shadow, won the 2019 Vine Award for Canadian Jewish Literature. She'll talk about what she learned in a workshop taught by Joel. Claire?
Thank you. 10 years ago, in 2011, I signed up for a QWF writing workshop with Joel Yanofsky. I'd published some fiction, but I wanted to know about this genre that Joel was teaching, creative nonfiction. And to be honest, I wasn't sure how creative one could be in nonfiction. How exactly did one get inventive with facts? I'd known Joel for a couple of decades. Our paths crossed regularly at literary events, and like many of the people here tonight, we both wrote for the Gazette book section. I greatly admired his wit and perceptiveness. To prepare for the workshop, I read his books, and most of them were, as one might expect, nonfiction. But there was a novel in there, Jacob's Ladder, published in 1997. The nonfiction was great, humorous, wide-ranging, but the novel I loved. I had a ton of obligations that needed attending to that week, yet I kept going back to it and laughing till there were tears in my eyes. In December, after Joel died, I reread Jacob's Ladder, and it happened again. I laughed till I cried, page after page, with that particular joy that comes from being in the hands of a writer brave enough to take risks, to throw the doors wide open. The workshop got underway, and Joel encouraged this same bravery in the 12 writers who had come to learn from him. He didn't talk much about himself. He listened warmly, encouragingly, helping us to throw open our own doors and reveal our stories. At one point, the question of privacy came up. I was writing an essay about my husband, and it was an intimate piece about reading and the conjugal bed. How much, I asked, can one reveal? Joel smiled. You know that smile he had, the one that telegraphed all the ironies that had crossed his mind but wouldn't be crossing his lips. My question went unanswered. He just let it float. How much can one reveal? Revelation is, of course, the essence of writing, regardless of genre. And Joel Yanofsky did it with immense skill. Joel might disagree, but I think fiction allows the closest approach to human truths. Joel liked to quote other writers, which has already been said. So I'm going to repay him, and here's one from Oscar Wilde. Give a man a mask and he'll tell you the truth. And here's Albert Camus. La fiction est le mensonge par lequel nous disons la vérité. Jacob's Ladder is superbly truthful. Listen to the first paragraph. This is what's happened so far. I'm expecting my best friend's wife to arrive any minute so we can begin our first official date. I'm also changing the linen on the queen-size bed in what was once my parents' master bedroom. Optimism doesn't come naturally to me and never has, but I suppose I'm learning a little more each day that anything is possible. This is, by the way, the kind of revelation I've been waiting for all my life. The one I prayed for 15 years ago when an oncologist at the Sacré-Cœur Hospital said nothing more could be done for my mother. And then, a year later, when another doctor at another hospital said the exact same thing about my father. So I stopped praying and eventually even stopped seeing it as an option. But when Angie parks her Toyota Corolla, red as a cherry lifesaver, in what was once my parents' driveway, I realized that even here in the suburbs, wishes come true. I'll tell you the difference as I see it between nonfiction and fiction, Yanofsky said in that workshop 10 years ago. In a nonfiction piece, I'll have this narrator and a character called the wife, into whose mouth I'll put words that approximate what was actually said, because quite frankly, who can ever remember? In fiction, he added, offering up another of those smiles, I give the wife a name. I had to laugh. It was classic Yanofsky, being inventive with facts, being funny too. It was what he did. It's what his books, fictional or not, still do, and always will. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Roma Gelblum-Bross, a Montreal writer and journalist and one of the founders of QWF. Active in various initiatives on behalf of writers for many years. Roma has written fiction and nonfiction in 3 languages and is the author of 2 collections of short stories in English. Roma?
Thank you very much, Gina. I'm also honored to be here, honored and saddened at the same time. But before I begin telling you about my 30-year friendship with Joel, I would like to read a poem written by the great Hebrew poet Chaim Nachman Bialik, who died when he was 61, 4 years younger than Joel. Similar to Joel, he was multi-talented. He not only wrote poetry, but was also a teacher, a translator, an essayist, and a publisher. In his poem, After My Death, Bialik told his friends how he would like to be mourned and remembered. In doing so, he probably was not thinking of himself only. Perhaps he was thinking of other poets, other writers of this world whom we would like to live forever. For we know that with their death, they take with them their rare and exquisite talents which have delighted and instructed us. Joel was one such man. When he was present among us, his friends, colleagues, and students, we knew that if such people as he existed, things were kind of okay with our imperfect world. I will read 1 stanza in Hebrew and 2 stanzas in English. אחרי מותי סיבדו ככה לי, היה איש וראו, איננו עוד. קודם זמנו מת האיש הזה, ושירת חייו באמצע נפסקה, וצער מאוד מאוד. עוד מזמור אחד היה לו, והנה אבד המזמור לעד, אבד לעד. After my death, mourn me this way. There was a man, and look, he is no more. Before his time he died, and the song of his life has suddenly ended. And it is so sad, so very, very sad. But this song got lost forever. And therefore it is so sad, so very, very sad. He had a violin, a living, speaking soul, and the poet confided his words to it. All his heart's secrets he revealed, making all the strings vibrate. but one secret he kept hidden. Round and round his fingers played. There was one more song in him, and now it's lost forever. And it is sad, so very, very sad, and great is the pain. Just as this poem points to a gaping hole in time, I am driven to think of the time that Joel came into my life at an important junction. Something happened that I never imagined would. Late in life, in a language that was that was my first learned tongue, I had just published my first book, a collection of stories entitled To Samarkand and Back. It was launched one fall day as I tremulously waited to see if anyone was going to think something good about it. A few days after the book launch, a friend phoned me to say excitedly that a review of my book was just published in the Canadian Jewish News. I wanted to know who had written this review. Joel Yanofsky, she said excitedly. Joel Yanofsky. The name sounded to me better than my favorite piece of music. Am I not lucky? I had never met Joel, but routinely read and liked his column and reviews in the Gazette. At first, I wanted her to read the whole thing to me, but since she lived nearby, I asked to meet with her so that I could read it myself. And what a great review it was. It wasn't that he praised everything about it. It was that when he pointed out any flaws, gently and knowingly, I felt certain that he treated my book seriously, on par with the other writers. It was as if he was opening the door for me to an important club. And then he was there at another important moment. My collection of stories were shortlisted for that year's Huspel Award in Fiction. Joel was one of the 3 judges. At the gala in the Ritz Hotel ballroom to hear the result for that occasion, I stood with a corsage pinned to my blouse, my heart pounding loudly, waiting with the 2 other finalists for the results. Finally, the results were announced. No, it was not I who got the prize. It was someone else. Of course, I was disappointed. Friends congregated around me, handing me tissues and murmuring consoling words, when suddenly Joel appeared. He was pushing his way towards me, smiling his famous smile. He shook my hand. Next time, Roma, he said, and I wanted you to know, I voted for you. It's not always the best book that wins. Then he turned away and was swallowed by the crowd. Though I feel sad at having lost this dear friend and teacher, I want to remember him at happy times when we met in the streets of Montreal and stopped to exchange literary gossip at book launches, his and our mutual friends, literary galas and festivities. Especially here tonight with so many of you who have cherished memories of Joel, I want to hold that happy time when years ago I was wrapping my participation in the Quebec Writers Federation memoir workshop he had led. He joined the class as a party in my house. It was such a pleasant get-together with chats, food and drink. And I guess that then he and I, thought that when we were going to continue routing each other on like this forever. I took a photo of Joel sitting in my living room in the midst of his students under a palm tree, reading one of the submissions, smiling warmly. I am sure that this is how he would like to be remembered. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roma. I'd like now to introduce Sean Michaels. Sean is a wonderfully astute music critic and novelist. His debut novel, Us Conductors, was awarded the 2014 Giller Prize and its follow-up, The Wagers, appeared in 2019. Very pleased to have with us tonight Sean Michaels. Sean.
Hi, everyone. I met Joel at the Banff Centre for the Arts in 2009. We were both there for their literary journalism program. I felt like a dumb pup writing an article about the Paris catacombs, and he was like a battle-scarred dog with a nipped ear. He was working on what was then just an essay titled Bad Animals. Joel and I immediately became friends. Then again, I think he immediately befriended everyone he met. We sat together at the buffet, eating like millionaires. We hiked up a nearby tiny mountain. He took all my chips at poker. He saw into my writing like it was a sheet of clear plate glass. I'm not sure I've ever met another writer who read my work with as much clarity or wisdom. But the reason Joel befriended everyone was that a warmth emanated from him. This wasn't just his sense of humor, his storytelling, his raconteur's wit. Almost at once, you could feel that Joel cared about you. He seemed to care about everyone. It was nearly incredible. How can one live like that, caring so widely and so deeply? It must have been hard and scary and frequently devastating. He wrote to me once, "Being sad and grateful at the same time is probably the best you can hope for most days." I wonder now if he learned this from reading, from fiction, his compassion. Anyway, my friend Joel was sly and brilliant and hilarious and dogged. But what strikes me now was his tenderness. We talk so much these days about a toxic masculinity. Joel somehow dodged this toxicity, weaving through the world like a diminutive LeBron James. As Gina and Ian have said, he was a mensch. That's the Yiddish mensch, a good man, a good, decent person, more decent than almost anyone, and a better writer. I think part of Joel always wanted to be Richler, and part of him wanted to be LeBron, and part of him wanted to be exactly who he was: father, husband, friend. I don't know that he ever saw how much what some people, like me, wanted was to be like him. A writer, a reader, a true mensch. There's not much that's rarer. His memory is a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Now I'd like to introduce David Hamel. David is the author of 8 novels for grown-ups, 5 novels or 5 books for children. He's also one of the best translators in Montreal. The 5 books he did for children, he co-wrote with Marie-Louise Gay. David's next book is coming out in April, and it's called Lunging into the Underbrush, and it's a memoir. David's also a very scrappy basketball player and an inspired cook, and maybe some of these things will come up. David.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Scott. I think you surprised me there because some other people were supposed to go first before me, but that's okay. We got to think on our feet. Well, I was kind of interested by whoever put this thing together this evening, because the 3 of us guests of honor have been called rivals by Joel's rivals. And there are 2 card player rivals, and there's 1 basketball rival. And it's true that I've learned over the recent times that Joel took our friendly basketball rivalry a little bit maybe less friendly than I thought he did. But, you know, it's through games that people reveal themselves. That's why we play the games. That's why we play the games with the people that we play them with, because we want to get to know them through the way that they reveal themselves. And that was certainly true for Joel. I have very clear memories of running up and down the court with him. Sometimes it was pretty laborious for him. And maybe I was trying to encourage him, because I thought to myself, he and I are the two oldest players in this game, which has been going on forever. So if he drops out, who am I going to play against? And the thought that we wouldn't have each other as rivals anymore, always on opposite sides, that sort of, I thought, well, what's going to happen to me? And what's going to happen to him if he drops out of this game? Well, the last time we played against each other was probably February or March of 2020, before all this pate hit the fan. And, well, we didn't know how things were going to turn out. But I was, a rival. I was both a rival, and I was also somebody who was encouraging him to keep in the game. Not only so that I could keep in the game, but that so we could keep up this rivalry partnership. And of course, we had a lot of sort of trash talk, is what happens in sports. We devised what he called an algorithm, which was not an algorithm at all. It was just a bunch of nonsense between the three games we played in the evening, about how many baskets that he and I, the more marginal players, have to make if we were going to make our side win. And of course, it was nonsense algorithm, because sometimes I would score more baskets than him, and that his side would win, and vice versa. And of course, it was just kind of a lot of friendly, I thought, trash talk. And so that was okay. Now, Joel had a much better sense of the floor. He had a much better sense of strategy. He could set picks better than me. He had a lower sense of gravity, and was somewhat heavier than me. Of course, nobody is lighter than me. And so he was probably a better player. But I just wondered to myself, like last season, as we ran up and down that floor, just how long he was going to be able to keep on. And I certainly never anticipated this kind of end. Now, he had another influence on me, and I think probably, if I say it's a literary one, you shouldn't be surprised. Joel wrote a lot about himself. We've heard about that. And it's quite bizarre coming from a longtime novelist, maybe like me, but I always thought that writing about yourself was indecent. Now, I'm going to give you a second to chuckle and digest that. I'm not even sure if I know what I mean by that. I just thought that maybe writing without a mask was something that I didn't want to do, and that's why I stayed in fiction, and that's why I put on mask over mask over mask, and now we're not talking about COVID. And that's what I did in fiction writing. Maybe that's what I did, in real life. But then when I hit Bad Animals, I thought, okay, this is a way that you can write about yourself and go beyond yourself, if you like. And I have to say that Bad Animals has been in both of my kids' houses. I say kids, they're 33 and 37. And I think it's now in my oldest son's house. But that book has moved around the family, and that's saying a lot. And I realized that really you could write about yourself and leave room for other people. You could write about yourself and and find out things about yourself as you were writing. You can write about yourself and not make a kind of stock character out of who you were. And I have to say that all those things made it possible for me, and here's where Joel gets the last laugh, made it possible for me to write a memoir, my own self, which is going to come out next month. So thanks for that, Joel. And I don't know what our game is going to do without you, but anyway, you'll be there with us. Thanks a lot, and thanks for this evening.
Thanks, David. Sorry for throwing you that curveball. I had, one job here and messed it up, but we're on track now. The next writer I'd like to introduce is another former Montrealer who was much missed, Julie Bruck. Julie's a poet and a teacher who now lives in San Francisco. She and Joel were close friends for at least 35 years. Julie.
Boy, I'm sort of picking myself up off the floor after these tributes. They've been very beautiful. Joel liked to self-identify as a God-fearing atheist, quote unquote, but he was also a stubborn adherent of what he called magical thinking. And so I'm going to read two poems of magical thinking for our dear friend. And Peter Curtis, you got there first. Never mind. So the first one is called 514-681-9086. The phone number arrived in my sleep last night, printed numerals bold enough for me to wake, get up, and write them down. The week before you died, we talked across time zones, you riffing on what you'd eat if you ever got chemo, if it bought you time. Ice cream and pie, those fancy eggs at the place in Vermont where you stayed with Cynthia and Jonah. A wide pause for breath, then you added, I'd live through January, see 45 leave office, and watch 46 get sworn in. By morning, I was almost certain it was your home number, late 1980s. I checked an old address book, but it wasn't quite old enough. So I dug through dusty files for a dated work contact list, found the stapled dot matrix printout, your name and number, vivid as in the dream. Never mind that the number's been reassigned likely more than once. Much has happened since December, and now I can tell you. At the end, 45 said, it was criminal. So many dead people, those dead people voting all over the place. Well done, my wily friend. I can't wait to hear your gravelly voice again. How you ended every phone call with something that always left me inexplicably sad. The way you said so long. And this is a shorter piece. You'd have said I was making this up, but a devoted reader of yours has been stalking the friends who saw you through the end, threatening, insisting they've simply hidden you. How marvelous that would be. Mark has wrapped you in a hockey net in his basement in Point Claire, or Elaine has you locked in her study to finish your next book, maybe read a little fiction on the side. What a thrill awaits us, this wild intervention to find you captive, but blazingly alive, if a little pale from time inside. We'll go straight out for dinner as always, directly to the Greek place on St. Hubert in Duluth, each of us carrying wine. A bottle of olive oil and a basket of rough bread at the center of the table. One big enough for everyone, as it was, still is, will be.
Thanks, Julie, for Thanks very much. Thanks for breaking our hearts a little bit more. The next person I'd like to introduce now is Mike Schenker. Michael was an editor at the Gazette for nearly 3 decades. That seems to be a motif tonight. However, during those 3 decades at the Gazette, he had absolutely nothing to do with Joel. Their friendship only began after Mike left the paper 7 years ago. And from that moment on, it became an extraordinarily strong and deep friendship. And Mike is here to tell you about it. Mike.
Thanks very much for having me here. Actually, I want to correct that. Joel did have a professional relationship with me while I worked at the paper. It happened over that poker table that you've already heard about. He organized those games. And over the years, I provided Joel with a steady stream of undeclared income. You could say this was extra freelance Gazette money for him, since ultimately my poker losses came out of my paycheck. He would beat me with good cards. He'd beat me with bad cards. It didn't matter because Joel had a particular talent. He knew how to bluff. He was a passionate sports fan. Baseball, basketball, tennis, football. He watched it all on an enhanced cable sports package. But I had to wonder, how did this man find time to write? Baseball was the sport that we bonded over. That's where my Joel and me story really began. Joel and I grew up in different countries, but the old ways of baseball culture united us like Jews of the diaspora. We knew the same sacred statistics and records, the history, the arcane knowledge that collects in your head after a lifetime of love for the game, even if you can never play it. We spoke the same language, the infield fly rule, the suicide squeeze, the DH, the DL, the NL East. In the spring of 2014, we talked about seeing the Blue Jays in an exhibition game at the Big O, but I messed up. I thought Joel was bluffing, and I went to the game with someone else. That was a shaky start to our friendship. You have to understand, and I'm supported on this by all the research in such scholarly journals as Psychology Today and GQ. Grown men don't make new friends easily. We don't open up. So often we turn to sports to mediate the relationship. If you want to be friends, you might invite a guy over to watch a game, and he puts his feet up on your coffee table, and in Joel's household at least, he fights off one of your dogs for snack food. After a few games, you're friends. But Joel and I didn't have any history in March of 2014, so I played it safe and I didn't take our talk about the Blue Jay game very seriously. Still, after my mix-up, Joel had a comeback line. You can make it up to me, he said, and take me to New York for a Mets game. So I did. 3 months later, we were off on a road trip to New York, along with another speaker here tonight, Brian Demchinsky. Two baseball games in one day, and memories to take home. Picture Joel. This is the guy whose taste in exotic cuisine ends at chow mein and egg rolls. Picture him staring down a row of severed duck heads at a food counter in Chinatown. And picture him when the hotel failed to wheel in an extra cot for us. Picture Joel squeezing into a small double bed with me, spending the entire night in a reverse spoon position, trying to avoid body contact. By summer's end, Joel and I had history. What followed would be more poker and baseball, and we discovered a shared passion and disgust for another all-American game, politics. But it wasn't all fun and games, even for a wit like him who could make his friends and readers laugh in the face of life's tragedies. Joel and I grieved together. We both lost sisters just a year apart. There were long silences during our times together then. What could we say that didn't sound like a condolence card? But I knew he was there for me if I wanted to talk. That much he said. Still, I didn't realize how close we were, but I would soon find out. It's Tuesday, November 3rd. On the day the US electorate was about to pass judgment on Donald Trump and the Republicans in the Senate, Joel went into emergency surgery on his cancerous colon. Sometime after midnight, I started receiving text messages from him. When it seemed like the rest of the world was sleeping, we traded updates well into the early morning hours. His updates medical, mine political. At 3:30 a.m., he wrote, "I wake up every half hour feeling like I slept for days. But this was emergency surgery and I was a mess. So maybe it will be for the best. Any good news in the Senate?" Eventually, days later, it became clear that Trump would be defeated. I gave Joel the news. He replied, "I'll order the hospital champagne." It was vintage Joel. We texted and phoned more often after that. When he returned from the hospital, I drove him a few times to the doctor's appointments. The rides were sometimes silent, again. He was weak. He used a cane now for support, and I'd help ease him into my car for the short ride to the Jewish General. I didn't want to exhaust him with conversation. Then he complained I wasn't talking. The last time I drove him to the hospital, they kept him there for good. The final 4 weeks were a blur of texts, memories of that trip to New York. "You're the only man I ever slept with," he said in one message. More updates on his deteriorating condition, but still more humor when things were not so funny for him anymore. Joel's other friends tonight already told you about the little farewell gathering on Zoom from Joel's hospital bed on December 20th. As you heard, it was our last time together, and Joel, as you also heard, was still on his game. This he called his doom Zoom. 3 days later, he was gone. Look, we lost a great writer. We lost a generous and loyal man, devoted to his family and his friends, and never so giving with his time. Teaching and helping others, anytime, anywhere, those were basic reflexes for Joel. Whether it was sharing feature writing tips to my journalism students or devoting a 2.5-hour lunch at Chalet Barbecue to helping another editor friend on a 5,000-word feature. Joel just couldn't keep his talents to himself. He was a good friend these past 7 years, but it took a devastating illness to bring us closer. How else can I let him know I'd be there except to be there? I've stayed in touch with his wife, Cynthia, and she shared something with me this week that hit home. "He tried to get you to open up," she said. "That's funny," I replied. "I was trying to get him to open up." Those silences, Joel, I think I get it now. You were bluffing all along, and so was I. I can say it now. Love you, my friend.
Thank you, Mike. And now I'd like to introduce another person we miss not having in Montreal anymore, Joe Fiorito. Joe's an author, a poet, a retired newspaper columnist. He's been a friend of Joel's for over 30 years, a poker partner while he was here. He also knows how to cook a chicken better than anybody else I know. Joe.
Talk about hard act to follow, heartbreaking acts to follow. We moved to Montreal in 1991. I'd quit the CBC in Regina and was turning myself into a poet. I'd heard there was money in it. I heard wrong. Turns out there are many in it. That's my little joke for Joel. When we arrived, I didn't really know anybody in Montreal but Philip Sporer, and Philip introduced me to Julie Brooke, and Julie invited me into her poetry group, and that's where I met Mark Abley and Carmine Starnino. It must have been through Julie that I met Joel, because he invited me into his fiction, nonfiction workshop, and workshops take courage. The thing about Joel is that in terms of courage, he was 6'7" and he floated above the rim. I mean, he was fearless about himself and fearless with others. He was also kind, unafraid to mix humor with honesty and self-deprecation, qualities not found everywhere these days. It was through those early connections that I met the rest of the gang: Brian Dimchinsky, Don Winkler and Sheila Fishman, Charlie Foran, Scott Lawrence, Trevor Ferguson, David Hummel, Denise Roig and Ray Boschman, and it was the marriage of those last two that resulted in a stag and the longest running poker game in literature in Montreal. Joel won a lot, as everybody said. Fearless in literature, fearless in life, fearless with a pair of threes. He was a Shamadi man. He always winced comically when I reminded him that Hannah Gartner was from Shamadi. I reminded him as often as I could. We were a kind of gang. We went to each other's readings. We saw each other's work in the Gazette. We drank sour wine and ate wrinkled grapes at our book launches. And there were probably days when we were in the papers or on stage at the Bistro Cat, all at the same time. It seemed normal then. It seems magical now. If you were to pin those little colored threads, the crime scene strings, to my map, they all connect to Joel. First impression from 30 years ago, he was smart, funny, unsparingly honest with himself, gentle with others, quick with a pun if he thought you'd laugh, shy as if he wasn't sure to be noticed, he wanted to be noticed, frankly direct if he thought you were any good, and happiest if you made him laugh. I lived in Montreal for 6 years. Joel and I kept in touch after I moved away. It's been 25 years. But every time we met, when we saw each other again after a long time, it was like picking up a conversation that had been interrupted just a moment earlier. And that's the most precious friendship of all. A last quick thing. We both got letters from readers addressed to mangled versions of our last names. He got one letter. He says it was from somebody upset with, he said it was somebody from the government. And I think it was from somebody who was upset with one of his book reports. The letter was addressed to John Yanofsky. John Yanofsky, the Jewish John Wayne. I said without thinking, Duke. It fit him perfectly. I loved him. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks very much. And now finally, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the two people who knew Joel better than any of us did, both of whom, to borrow from Peter and Joel, are masterpieces. That's Cynthia Davis and Jonah Davis Yanofsky. Cynthia?
Okay, Jonah's going first.
A card. Showing you a card. Hi, everybody. I wrote a song called Song for Daddy. I wrote it when Daddy was in the hospital. I wrote it with Jonathan Harry Shrives. I feel bad about Daddy being gone. I like him. Thank you for coming and listening to my song. Rhubarb. Okay. 831.
Oh, Jonah, look at me.
Rhubarb.
Okay, this is the Daddy song, and we're gonna sing it nice, loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Today I wrote a song for Daddy. I hope it makes you smile. I miss you when you're not with me. Daddy, I love you. Daddy, I miss you. Daddy, I want you home. Daddy, I love you. Daddy, I miss you. Daddy, I want you home. 2, 3. I love the times when we're together. Going for walks or playing games. So many memories to choose from. I'm so lucky that you are mine. Daddy, I love you. Daddy, I miss you. Daddy, I want you home. Daddy, I love you. Daddy, I miss you. Daddy, I want you home. Daddy song.
Can you hear me and see me?
Yeah, everything's great, Cynthia.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. When Joel was in the hospital, he talked about all of the help that wasn't helping. But the help that Jonah and I have gotten over the past few months and are still getting helps a lot. So I would like to thank all of our helpers, our family and friends, for keeping in touch, for all of the cards, letters, condolences, and good wishes, for the care and activities for Jonah, for the shopping, dog walking, gifts of food, even a quilt made of Joel's clothes, for your donations to the Legacy Project, which I'll talk more about later, for this tribute and for a lot more. Thank you so much for the help that helps. I was asked to speak about the literary aspect of my life with Joel, and that started before we met when I read Jacob's Ladder. I brought my copy to our first date at a cafe near where I was living at the time. We've been fixed up by a mutual friend, and I was 38 and Joel was 42. I could tell that the befuddled, inappropriate, virginal character of Jacob was a version of Joel, and I wanted to see how exaggerated a version it was. I found out soon enough, it was slightly exaggerated. I asked Joel to sign the book right away in case our date didn't work out, and I never saw him again. Anyway, the date worked out, and quite soon after that, we got married and had Jonah. One thing that Joel being a writer and me being a reader meant in our marriage was that there was always something aside from our daily lives to discuss, think about, analyze, joke about, like books, articles, stories, podcasts, TV shows, the changes in the worlds of literature and journalism and academia and entertainment and politics. It was a conversation made of many conversations that lasted for 23 years. Through Joel's writing, I became a character in many articles and a book or two. I felt the horror, the embarrassment, and also the delight of being a character defined by Joel. I do appreciate him mostly exaggerating my qualities and downplaying my flaws. I knew that writing about Jonah and our family would be good for Joel, and I encouraged him in writing Bad Animals. I suspected that at the time that it would be his masterpiece, and I think that it was. When writing personal nonfiction, as some of you alluded to, Joel did what writers do to make their work clearer and easier on the reader, which is to change or enhance or amalgamate or tidy up facts. When some of these changes involved me, I would wince and complain. That's not what I said. You're putting words into my mouth. That's not how it happened. That's not where we were. Partly this bothered me because after Joel wrote something, everybody believed that it was exactly how it happened. When Bad Animals came out, I made sure to tell people not to believe everything they read. But my objections were mostly... Oh, my dog walked by. Sorry, be back in a sec. Where was I? My objections were mostly not serious, and that was because Joel always captured what was important, which was the emotional truth of the situation. Joel was very disciplined in his work as a writer, journalist, and teacher. He was working on an article or a review or a feature or a book or a project for the whole time that I knew him, even when it became more and more difficult for freelance writers. And he was always very generous with his time and wisdom with both novice and experienced writers, as some of you mentioned. And he hardly ever missed a book launch also if he knew the author. I went to many of the book launches and literary events with Joel, and those were some of the many ways that my life was enriched by Joel as a writer. Joel's lovely writer friends, hi out there, who he loved so much, were an important part of our lives. For me, yes, some of them are a little bit scary, and you really don't want to make a spelling mistake or use the wrong pronunciation or turn of phrase. Also, they seem to think that everybody wants to write a book. Really, some of us would rather paint a picture or pretty much anything else. But Joel's friends are truly creative and delightful, and many of them are sticking around and being here for me and Jonah. I want to read a very short excerpt from a manuscript he was working on. It's completely out of context, as the chapter was about his sister Marilyn's illness and death. Hope no other dog walks by. Okay. Maine was my sister's vacation destination for almost 30 summers. I'd gone with them most of the time, including the summer 19 years ago when Jonah was 8 months old. Cynthia, Jonah, and I stayed a few nights in a condo my sisters had rented for 2 weeks. And Cynthia and I drove home, kicking ourselves for not arriving sooner or staying longer. New parents, we were exhausted all the time. Once we were there, though, 6 in the morning wake-ups were dreamlike. We were barely awake. Cynthia fed Jonah first thing. Then I handed him off to my sisters like a baton in a relay race. Renee and Marilyn were set to go as soon as I emerged from our bedroom with the baby. They were already showered, dressed, and finished with their breakfast. The first morning I dressed Jonah, but was quickly made to understand that that sort of effort on my part was neither required nor appreciated. They had his beachwear, the new beachwear they bought him while they were awaiting our arrival, already laid out for him. They had snacks and 60 SPF suntan lotion ready too for their pre-planned walk around the cove with him in his stroller. After that, they set Jonah up on the beach under an umbrella. He was surrounded by shovels and pails, and he was barely old enough to grip, let alone lift. Meanwhile, Cynthia and I went back to sleep or luxuriated in bed until the unseemly hour of 10 or 11. When we finally caught up with the 3 of them, we received a full report on our son's latest nap, his latest poop, his latest attempt with some help to put a shovelful of sand into a tiny pail. All of it was meticulously documented on Marilyn's video camera. It all counted as evidence, proof of how much fun he was having with them, and they with him. Day after day, I, a lifelong grumbler, marveled at the fact 5 individuals could all be so unambiguously happy at the same time. Here's a photo from that trip. The Legacy Project, approved by Joel, is the Joel Yanofsky Library and Resource Center of the Friendship Circle of Montreal. The Friendship Circle is a group that provides care and activities and community for people with special needs and their families. We've used many of their services over the years and do the Walk for Friendship every year to support their efforts. The Friendship Circle did a lot to help and care for us during Joel's illness and since then. The Yanofsky Library, thanks to many of your generous donations, is beginning to take shape within the Friendship Circle. The project is already starting to provide resources for individuals with special needs and their families. Jonah is taking an active role and will have more of a role when COVID is over. The scope of the project depends on donations received. It's a really nice way to honor Joel, and your contributions are appreciated very much. The information about the Legacy Project is in the chat. And so if you want to find out about how to contribute, look in the chat or look up Friendship Circle. And if you did already, we thank you very much. On a personal note, I know that a lot of you are fiction writers. And as Joel is no longer writing about me, I request to have a character in your next book named after me. She can be a major, minor character, I don't care. It's okay if she's completely deplorable, but whole name, Cynthia Davis. Thank you very much.
Cynthia, you've got it. Cynthia, thanks for allowing all of us to do this tonight, to let you and Jonah know how much you mean to us, how much Joel has meant to us and continues to mean to us. For those of you who have not read Bad Animals, I strongly suggest that you do, and you'll see just how deeply a family can love one another. It's an extraordinary book among a host of extraordinary books that Joel put together. Joel's last gift to us, I think, as I alluded to earlier tonight, was, and he did this deliberately, was to bring us all closer together. Many of us who have spoken here tonight have known each other for a long time. Many of you who have commented in the chat room are also people we have known for a long time and perhaps haven't seen or spoken to for a long time. And it's wonderful to see your names and your comments. Joel's last gift to us truly was to bring us all closer together. And I think a number of us have spoken about this with each other, and for this we'll be eternally grateful. Again, I want to thank QWF for making it possible for this to happen, for making it possible for us to get together and pay one final tribute to Joel. And I want to thank all of you, 200 plus, who joined us tonight for this, who have contributed to the chat room with your own tributes, and who have made this a truly special evening. Thank you all so much. And again, as Cynthia said, if you're writing a novel, that's all. Let there be a spate of books coming out with a character named Cynthia Davis in it. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a good night.